Hey everybody out there, it's Timothy here with Mana Rocks, and we are doing our limited set review of Guilds of Ravnica, starting with the Dimir cards. We'll be looking at each guild individually, and in each guild, we'll be looking at the cards that were specifically designed with that guild in mind. So we'll see in just a second that each guild has its own mechanic, and the cards that I'll be looking at in each video are either the gold cards that fit into that guild, or the cards that have the mechanic of that guild. So for instance, we'll be seeing mono blue cards and mono black cards in this video, but not all the blue and black cards in the set. The cards that aren't tied to guilds will be covered in a completely separate video. I'm still tinkering with how I want to do reviews for this channel and how much I want to elaborate on cards or go into depth. And I feel like I do like to explain a little bit more and go into detail about each card. So this will not be like the split second review I did for Core Set 2019. This is first thing we want to mention about Guilds of Ravnica design in general is that each of the two color guilds, and there are 5 of them in the set, has a specific mechanic that is tied to that guild. I think Dimir is going to be the strongest because it has the most generic mechanic, which is Surveil. And Surveil means that whenever you Surveil X, Surveil 2, Surveil 3, you look at that many cards off the top of your library. You can put any of them into the graveyard, and you can put the rest back on top of your library in any order. So obviously very reminiscent of Scry, and almost always going to be better than Scry. For newer players, it's worth keeping in mind that your graveyard is a resource, and a lot of newer players don't like losing cards or putting cards in their graveyard, but keep in mind putting cards on the bottom of your library usually means that you're never going to see them for the rest of the game, whereas putting them in your graveyard at least gives you access to them with some of the other cards. The reason I said Dimir, I think, is going to be the strongest of the guilds in the set is because Surveil overlaps with 2 of the other guilds, and it's just generically powerful. Surveil is just a good mechanic. Scry is great, so Surveil is probably a little bit better than that, almost always. Sometimes it won't be. But Dimir also overlaps with Golgari. It shares black, and Golgari has a mechanic that cares about creatures in the graveyard. And Izzet, which shares blue with Dimir, has Jumpstart, which cares about instants and sorceries in the graveyard. So we're going to see a lot of 3-color decks with Dimir as kind of the backbone, and either Golgari or Izzet as, I think, maybe the supporting archetype to go with Dimir. But I do think Dimir is going to be the strongest, and that's off the back of Surveil just being great. Surveil is a great way to dig through your library while also filling up the graveyard for these other mechanics. Now, what we're going to do is first look at the sideboard cards or the build-arounds. These are cards that, sure, you can put in your deck, but they don't really reach their full potential unless you have a deck constructed around them. The very first card on our list is something that I'm probably underrating quite a bit. This actually, having looked at it a lot more, is a lot stronger than I'm giving it credit for here, and might just not even be a sideboard card, just a card that you're interested in playing. But that card is Thoughtbound Phantasm. It's a single blue for a 2/2 defender, which is not a card I'm interested in playing, but that can definitely hold down the fort. It says whenever you surveil, put a +1/+1 counter on it, and as long as it has 3 or more +1/+1 counters on it, it can attack as though it didn't have defender. So the reason I call this a build around is because obviously you're not super interested in playing it unless you're constantly surveilling, and you do need a quote-unquote surveil deck to make this reach its full potential. But having it in this category doesn't mean that it's bad. Once it reaches its full potential, you've got a huge beater, and you can actually build a deck to take advantage of this card quite a bit. Play this on turn 1, surveil on turn 2, 3, and 4, and suddenly you're attacking with, what, a 5/5 on turn 4? That's really nothing to scoff at, and it will block until you get to that point. So even if you don't get the nuts and start attacking on turn 4, this thing builds up over time, and it becomes a threat as the game goes on. Along that same line, we have Enhanced Surveillance, which is admittedly worse than the Phantasm. This is a 2-mana enchantment. It's 1 and a blue for an uncommon, and it says you may look at an additional 2 cards each time you surveil. You may also exile it to shuffle your graveyard into your library. I think that second clause is not exactly something we're interested in. It's there just in case, I guess, you surveil too much and put too many cards in your graveyard and you become close to decking yourself. You have this as kind of a reset button to start digging through your deck again. I don't think this is really worth a card because Surveil by itself is already good at digging through your library. Surveil 2 is great. Turning that into Surveil 4 is, obviously better, but probably not worth a card when the mechanic by itself is pretty decent. This does turn Surveil 1 into Surveil 3, so if you have small, cheap ways to Surveil 1 or Surveil 2, then this does dig through your library quite a bit. And if you have silver bullet cards against your opponent, then this can definitely get you there, but it's really bad later in the game once you've dug through your library, once you've found the pieces you need. It's not something you want to top deck, and I don't really think it's worth a card. I'd probably stay away from it, but it has a unique design to it. Along these same lines, we have Whisper and Snitch, much better than the enhanced Surveillance. Get it? Surveillance. Whisper and Snitch is 1 and a black for a 1/3 uncommon vampire rogue. It says whenever you surveil for the first time each turn, it deals 1 damage to each opponent and you gain 1 life. So first thing to note here is that it says each turn. So if you have instants or enchantments or something that can surveil on an opponent's turn, then you can double up on this ability once on your turn, once on an opponent's turn. It's a build around. Clearly, you have to have a lot of surveil cards before this becomes an option that you're interested in. But once you get to that point, and again, I don't think it should be too hard to get to that point, I think Whisper and Snitch becomes very good. Hence it being an uncommon. If this was a common, then you could have a pretty busted deck with a bunch of surveil cards. I think you need something along 3+ surveil cards before this is something you're interested in putting in your deck, and that doesn't seem like it's going to be that hard to do. I think this card is going to be good. It's going to be another backbone of the quote-unquote surveil deck, and I think you'll be happy to play it in most situations. This information campaign, another surveil card, is 1 blue-black for an uncommon enchantment that says when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card and each opponent discards a card. And whenever you surveil, you can bounce the enchantment back to your hand. So it's a repeated card advantage machine as the game goes on. On its face, if you completely ignore being able to rebounce this to your hand and replay it, it's a 2-for-1. It's going to put your opponent down a card, and it's going to net you even on cards. It's not exactly card advantage for you, but it does put your opponent down a card, so it is a nice little 2-for-1. You do have to be using this multiple times before you're interested in playing it at all. I guess a cantrip that makes your opponent discard a card isn't the worst, but it's not really adding to the board, so if you're playing against Boros and getting beaten down, this is not really what you're looking for. This is the type of card that is more of a cute enchantment to build around. I don't think it's inherently super powerful, since as the game goes on, your opponent's going to be able to play their cards out, and the discard part starts to lose its value, but it can be repeated card draw as the game goes on. All right, next category are the low pick playables. These include the unplayables as well as the cards that you're just not really looking to pick up. You want them on the wheel if you want them at all, and a lot of times you'll pick them up after the wheel already. They're never going to be first pick. They're not cards you have to fight over. They're just cards that you'll play if you really have to fill in the last couple slots. The first one's a rare. This is Unmoored Ego. It's 1 blue and a black for a rare sorcery. Already said rare, but there you go. You choose a card name, and then you may search your opponent's graveyard, hand, and library for up to 4 cards with that name and exile them. Then they shuffle and draw a card for each card you took out of their hand. Again, they're only drawing a card for each card you took out of their hand. So let's say you name Swamp, because you can name lands with this card. Very interesting. If your opponent reveals their hand and they have a single Swamp in their hand, but they also have 3 Swamps in their deck that you take away, then they're going to draw 1 card. So this is always, always, always going to be card disadvantage no matter what, since taking cards out of your opponent's library is not card advantage or disadvantage, and it always replaces the cards that you take out of their hand. Taking cards out of your opponent's library, even if they're really good cards, doesn't do that much, because there's a chance they might have never drawn those cards in the first place, and you used a whole card from your hand to take away the possibility of your opponent drawing a card. Specific card, nonetheless. Naming a land with this doesn't seem great, but if your opponent's splashing, I guess you could take away their basics of a certain splash color. That seems a little bit on the weak side to me, too. Honestly, the only situation where I ever play these cards is if my opponent has a card that I absolutely cannot beat in my deck, maybe a giant hexproof creature or something like that, then I would consider bringing this in. But again, I'm going to be down a card to snipe my opponent's best card out of their deck or something along those lines, and they might have never drawn it in the first place. I would stay away from this. I'm not really interested in even having it in my sideboard for certain situations, so I think it's probably Dimir's worst card overall. The next one is another card I might be undervaluating. This is Mnemonic Betrayal with some absolutely sick art. Don't know what's going on, but it's pretty sweet. This is also 1 blue-black for a sorcery, a mythic rare this time. And essentially it exiles your opponent's graveyard, and then you may cast cards from that exiled pile until the end of the turn using any color of mana. And then the cards that you don't cast return to the opponent's graveyard at the end of turn. Mnemonic Betrayal also exile itself. So it essentially lets you cast cards from your opponent's graveyard, and you don't have to worry about color restrictions. Now, this could just be a fantastic card. The reason I have it in the low pick playables is because it's really wonky kind of effect, and I'm not sure how it's going to play out yet. But it is very interesting effect too. First off, it can be used as graveyard hate. If you can cast this and then take away your opponent's graveyard matters cards out of their graveyard, then they lose a little bit of the value, and obviously you get to gain that value back. And B, this can be just card advantage. If you cast this and then you cast 2 or 3 cards out of your opponent's graveyard, then you've definitely run away with your opponent's graveyard, and using your opponent's cards against them is pretty good feeling and limited, I think. Problem with this card is that you might play against a deck where your opponent's cards don't really further your game plan. So if you're playing Dimir and your opponent's playing Boros, you might not want the small creatures that they're playing, or the little weenies, or the pump spells, or things like that nature. So Mnemonic Betrayal, probably a sideboard card against other Dimir decks, or decks that care about their graveyards, or maybe even decks with just a bunch of cheap spells so that you can get maybe a 2 or 3 for 1 off of this card. But I think it's wonky, and I'll have to see it play out before I give it the big thumbs up. For now, I think it's probably a little bit on the weak side, but we'll see. Dazzling Lights, 1 blue for an instant. Target creature gets -3/-0 until end of turn. Surveil 2. This card's pretty weak. The effect's not great, -3/-0. But anything with Surveil is going to gain a little bit of value here. And Surveil 2 is significant. This is an instant too, which we've already seen a couple cards that play very well with instant speed Surveil, and we'll see a couple more. So if you really, really care about Surveil and you can't find better cards than Dazzling Lights, then this could fill the spot. 1 mana to Scry 2 is already probably decent. Not great, but tacking on a potential combat trick and a Scry 2 or a Surveil 2 onto it could do the trick. I don't think it's great, but you could play it. Dimir Spybug is blue-black for a 1/1 insect with flying and menace. And it also says, whenever you Surveil, put a 1/1 counter on Dimir Spybug. Now, don't get me wrong, I think this is a low pick, but I think this is actually going to be a strong card. If you get to curve a creature or maybe nothing into turn 2 Dimir Spybug and then Scry 2, potentially the remainder of the game, I'm sorry, not Scry 2, but just Surveil in general, then Dimir Spybug gets out of hand pretty quickly. Play this on turn 2 and then Surveil on turn 3, and you have a 2/2 Menace flyer, which is definitely worth 2 mana. And then Scry multiple times, this becomes an actual threat. The problem with this card is that if you top deck it later in the game, it's quite bad. A 1/1 flyer for 2 mana is just not what you want. And you do need a pretty large amount of Surveil, I think, to make this good. The first Surveil makes it worth a card. The second Surveil makes it really good, and anything past that makes this really strong card in general. Thought Erasure is blue-black for a sorcery, also uncommon, and it says the opponent reveals their hand. You may choose any non-land from it, they discard it, and you Surveil 1. So a Thoughtseize, essentially. Just discard that can take anything is pretty decent. It's just 1 for 1 in your opponent off of Thought Erasure is never that exciting. Playing cards like Duress or even Thoughtseize Unlimited are not the most insane things you can do, and I think people vastly overrate how good something like this is. Scry in 1 or Surveil in 1 on top of that is definitely a little bit of a bonus, but not enough that I'm going to pick this card highly. I think once I'm in Dimir and I know I have Surveil payoffs, I'm happy to pick this card, but I'm not picking it very highly. I'm probably not using my first couple picks to take just a targeted discard spell. So Barrier of Bone strikes me as one of the worst Surveil cards in the set. It's a black mana for an 0/3 defender. It's a common skeleton wall. It says whenever it enters the battlefield, Surveil 1. We'll see this effect again a couple times. It's just not an exciting body to put this on. A 0/3 defender is just never going to get in combat, and it's going to get run over at some point. So I guess if you're playing against Boros, this can lock down things, and it gives you a tiny little bit of value with Surveil. Also, this card is decent in Golgari, which I'll mention now since it will die at some point. It can put a card in the graveyard, and then it puts itself in the graveyard at some point when it dies, assuming you're not playing against a bunch of flyers, and that's good for Overgrowth or Undergrowth or whatever it's called. When we get to it, we might mention it again, but this seems like one of the worst ways to just trigger Surveil, but if you're really grasping for straws, I guess this will do the trick. Next category are your medium power level cards. So these are not quite the cards that I'm happy to first, second pick, not cards that I'm looking to get past right away. But these are cards that I think are going to fill their roles quite nicely. First one on the list here is Night Veil Sprite. This is 1 in a blue for a 1/2 flyer. Whenever it attacks, you surveil 1. So right off the bat, you have a card that can repeatedly surveil, and it's worth mentioning that there are probably only 3 to 4 cards in this set that can surveil multiple times over the course of the game. One of them is a mythic, and some of them might be rares. I can't think of all of them off the top of my head, but there aren't a lot of ways to repeatedly surveil. Night Veil Sprite is a cheap way to do that. You can surveil literally every turn of the game, assuming that this can get a clean attack in and you're not under a lot of pressure to the point where it has to block or something like that. It reminds me a lot of something like Sigiled Starfish or Dryad Greenseeker, where it gives you incremental advantage over the course of the game. I don't think it's as good as those cards just on face value, because it does have to attack to give you that value, and you may not be in a position where you can attack. That's why I call this a medium power level card, but this is the type of card that functions as an engine piece for the Surveil deck. Next up, Mission Briefing. This is a card that is very much hyped up for Standard and Modern and all of those formats that we're not talking about here, but in Limited, I think it's probably not that great. Flood of Recollection was double blue. Just get back an instant or sorcery from your graveyard to your hand. You didn't even have to cast it right away. This is an instant speed version of that, but it surveils 2, and you basically have to cast the spell right away. I don't think Mission Briefing is really what you want to be doing, but it is a way to surveil. It's worth money, so you're going to take it anyway. You might as well play it, right? I think it's a fine card if you have a lot of instants or sorceries that are worth recasting, like really good removal spells or draw spells, then sure, you can play Mission Briefing. But I think paying 2 mana just to reuse an instant or sorcery from your graveyard is not really worth a card slot in your deck. Unexplained Disappearance is 1 in a blue for an instant. It's a common, and it says return target creature to its owner's hand. Surveil 1. Reminds me of Voyage's End from Theros, which was the same mana cost, same effect, except it had Scry 1 instead of Surveil 1. So this is 9 times out of 10 going to be better than that, and Voyage's End was quite good. I just like 2 mana bounce spells in general. They can play the tempo game, they can buy you time. Surveil can definitely be a piece of the puzzle for your deck here. And it is instant speed Surveil again. We've seen a couple of these spells, so if you have a means or a need to surveil on your opponent's turn, this is the type of thing that can do it while also setting your opponent back a little bit. Not a card you want a ton of, but something you'll definitely play the first, maybe even the second of. Darkblade Agent is a card I'm actually quite excited about. It's 1 blue-black for a 2/3, so 3 mana 2/3. It's a common human assassin, and it says as long as you've surveilled this turn, it has Death Touch, and whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card. Very sneaky card, definitely Dimir flavor here. So this card does a lot. First off, it's just a 2/3 for 3, which is fine. That's why I put it in the medium power level, because if you're not using the ability, then it's not an exceptional body by any means. But it plays a little bit of a mind game with your opponent. When you attack with this, maybe into one of their bigger creatures like a 3/3 or something, they've got to think that you might have an instant speed way to surveil and give this creature Death Touch. And then if they don't block it, you might just have that same exact situation and be able to replace the card. You might be able to cast an Unexplained Disappearance, give this its ability at instant speed, and then just draw a card. This is the type of card that works fantastic with the Sprite, which lets you surveil turn after turn after turn. And I think this card's just going to play out fine. Mephitic Vapors, Mephitic, I don't know what that means, but the spell is a 2 black sorcery for a common, and it says all creatures get -1/-1 until end of turn, surveil 2. -1/-1 is going to be really good against some decks and really bad against others. If you're playing against Boros or especially Selesnya, which has a lot of token generation, then this card goes way up in value. If you're playing against Dimir and a lot of the Golgari decks, this card loses a ton of value. It has Surveil 2 tacked onto it, so it's probably a card you can put in your deck regardless of the situations and then board it out when it's not good. Whisper Agent is 1 and double blue-black hybrid mana, so 3 mana total. For a 3/2 human rogue, it's a common with flash, and when it enters the battlefield, surveil 1. So this is very similar to Hired Blade from M19, except it has surveil 1 attached to it, and that really makes all the difference. Yes, this is a Dimir card, but you can cast this in non-blue decks or non-black decks because of the hybrid mana. There's a cycle of these as well with the same kind of mana requirements, 1 hybrid mana card or creature for each of the guilds, which is nice. I think this card is fine. It's basically filler. It's not bad. It can be used as a removal spell against a creature that's attacking into you, or you could just flash it in and get a sneaky attack in or something like that. Not a high pick, a card that I'm fine filling out my cart with, though. There is a cycle of split cards. There's an uncommon in each guild, and there's a rare in each guild. And they work like this. The first half has hybrid mana in its cost. The second half is specific to that guild. So the first half is the type of thing that you might be able to cast in a non-Dimir blue deck, like Is It, or you might be able to cast it in Golgari. But the second half is really something that you're only interested in if you're playing Dimir. Discovery is 1 and hybrid blue-black for a sorcery. It says Surveil 2, then draw a card. That's fine. It basically cycles itself, but gives you a little bit of selection. 2-mana sorcery makes this a little bit, it's not huge, but if Surveil matters for your deck, then you'll consider playing it. The second half is Dispersal, which is an instant. It's 3 blue-black, and it says each opponent returns a non-land permanent they control with the highest converted mana cost among all their permanents to their hand, and then they discard a card. They have just one really expensive card on board that you need to get rid of, and they have no cards in hand, then this is basically a removal spell for it. It is worth noting with these split cards that they do not have Fuse, the mechanic from Dragon's Maze or whatever it was, so you can't cast them both together. You have to pick one or the other. I think Dispersal is the stronger effect here, but Discovery is the type of thing that you could just cast it instead of Dispersal. And these split cards are always going to be good. You'll splash for them a lot in other decks because you can almost always cast the first half, and the second half will be upside for that deck if you happen to draw your splash mana. But if you end up Dimir, then there's no way you're not casting this spell or not putting it in your deck. I think it's quite good. Notion Rain is 1 blue-black for a sorcery. It's a common, and it says Surveil 2. Then draw 2 cards. It deals 2 damage to you. I don't really exactly know what a Notion Rain is, but it's happening. We've got it. Let's make it work. This is clearly just Read the Bones with Surveil 2 instead of Draw 2. And Read the Bones is a great card. It's something you normally want one of in basically any Dimir deck you're going to play. You'll probably play maybe 2 of them, especially if you're a controlling deck and you can protect your life total. But you probably don't want too many of them. Think of Divination. You probably want 1 to 2 Divinations in most of your control decks, but you don't really want more than that. Drawing too many Divinations is just spinning your wheels, and this one makes you lose life, so you can't just cast nothing but Notion Rains all game. But it does let you look at 4 potential cards and ditch some of them to the graveyard, so I think it's going to be a good role player in control decks, and just a card you'll play in every Dimir deck anyways. We have Dimir Informant as the last card in this category. It's 2 and a blue for a 1/4 common human rogue, and it says when it enters the battlefield, Surveil 2. Reminds me of Omen Speaker, 1 mana more expensive and 1 more toughness, so very good against decks that are trying to attack you early. It's a good blocker, it can take down tokens in combat, and it puts a roadblock in front of the opponent while also giving you a little bit of an advantage, just like Omen Speaker. So I think this card's going to be good. Anything that has Surveil attached to it, even if it looks mediocre, is going to play really well in these decks if you have the build-arounds that we mentioned at the beginning of the video. And I think you'll play, 2, maybe even 3 of these if you have a really strong late game and you just need to make sure that you get through the early game. I think it's a solid card, not something that you're looking to pick highly, but the type of card that you're pretty happy to wheel or pick up once you know that you're in Dimir. Next up are the high power level cards. These are the cards that, if I have to first pick them, then sure, that's fine if I get a bad pack or something like that. But these are cards that I'm always happy playing if I end up in a Dimir deck, and I'm hoping to get past them. You want to open a bomb rare and then get past these cards second, maybe third, fourth, probably pushing it. First up is City Watch Sphinx. It's 5 and a blue for a 5/4 uncommon Sphinx. So 6 mana, 5/4 flyer. And it says when it dies, Surveil 2. So die to Surveil 2 is a significant difference from enter the battlefield Surveil 2, especially if your opponent puts an enchantment on this, something like Luminous Bonds or something that makes it so it can't attack, then you're not really going to get that value. Basically, you're getting a pile of stats and a little bit of advantage if your opponent finds a way to answer this, but it is weak to those enchantment-based removal spells. We're going to see another common here in just a second that I think is a little bit better than the Sphinx, which is ironic, but this is a little bit of a beater more than it is an advantage card, and having just played with Horizon Scholar, again, in M19. I think this is a little bit worse than Horizon Scholar. You really want the advantage when it enters the battlefield, but at least it pays you off by being a big flyer, and if your opponent does answer it by most means with a removal spell or mid-combat or something like that, then you get a little bit of an advantage back from it. I think it's a fine card, definitely a big flyer, and flyers tend to end games, so can't put it anything lower than just a high power level card in my opinion. We have Sinister Sabotage next, generic cancel type variant. 1 blue for an uncommon instant, counter target spell, Surveil 1. Solid card. I think cancel is going to be a pretty good card in this format. People are going to be casting these huge convoke spells. People are going to be playing the long game with their overgrowth spells or undergrowth spells or whatever kind of growth spells they have in Golgari. People in Dimir are going to be, or rather not Dimir, but Izzet are going to be setting up, and there's just a lot of long game. This loses value against Boros because Boros does want to play the early game and get in attackers early, so if this is your means of interacting early in the game, then it's probably not going to make the cut against Boros, but against any of the other guilds, and especially in the mirror match, I imagine this is going to be great. I feel like 3-mana counterspells are in a good spot in this format, based on my thinking that it's going to be a slow format, but we'll have to wait and see. I think this is a card you want for your control decks. Next up, the common I was talking about, Watcher in the Mist. He's a ghost. He's like, please let me inside. Anyway, 3 double blue for a 3/4 common flyer. This card is common, which is striking to me that the Sphinx we just saw was uncommon, but it has Enter the Battlefield Surveil 2, so very similar to Cloud Reader Sphinx from Dominaria or Horizon Scholar if you want to make that comparison. 5 mana, 3/4 flyer, exactly like Cloud Reader Sphinx, although it is double blue, so harder to splash than Sphinx was in Dominaria, which matters. And Surveil 2 when it enters the battlefield rather than Surveil 2 when it dies is just a huge difference. Being able to put this on the board and then immediately dig for more follow-up, more control spells, more beaters, something like that is a huge thing on a flyer that's already a very playable card. Next, we have a rare Blood Operative, 1 black for a 3/1 rare Vampire Assassin. It has a lifelink, so 1 black 3/1 lifelinker, that's okay. When it enters the battlefield, you may exile target card from a graveyard. That's actually a really good ability in this format. You can snipe a Jumpstart card. You can take something that matters for Overgrowth, Undergrowth, Golgari Growth, and just lower their creature count for that deck. And it says, whenever you surveil, if Blood Operative is in your graveyard, you may pay 3 life. If you do, return it to your hands. First off, this works really well with Surveil. It's a good card to dump into the graveyard if you see it on top of your library with other Surveil cards. And then once you Surveil later in the game, you can just put it back in your hand. Second off, it's just great to cast this, trade it off for a creature because it's going to gain you 3 life with lifelink. And then once you Surveil, you pay that 3 life, and essentially you net 0 life, right? You're not going up, but you're also not just paying 3 life from your starting life total. You already gained that. And then you replay it, you trade it off for another creature. Next up, we have Connive or Concoct, which is the rare Dimir split card. Connive is 2 and double blue-black hybrid mana, so 4 mana total for a sorcery that says gain control of target creature with power 2 or less. Pretty simple. It's not an enchantment, so you just get to permanently take that creature. And even though it only takes small creatures, that can be fine, especially against something like Selesnya, which tends to want all of its creatures for a Convoke. Being able to take a creature from a Selesnya deck is kind of like stealing mana from them, really. It's not an amazing card, not a bomb, since it's never going to take a huge creature, but if you can take a little value creature, maybe like a Surveillance Sprite or something like that, I think you'll be pretty happy, and it's a 2-for-1 no matter what, so pretty decent just already on its own. Concoct is the other half, which is 3 blue-black for a sorcery. It says Surveil 3, then return a creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. And that's what I'm talking about, especially with these big flyers we just saw. It's pretty easy to Surveil, ditch one of them to the graveyard, then bring that creature back. Also worth noting that it doesn't target, since you have to Surveil 3, just like Mission Briefing, which I failed to mention with that card. You get the point, right? There's also not a lot of instant speed interaction with the graveyard in the set in the first place. Blood Operative is one of the few cards that can actually even get rid of cards from a graveyard, so worth mentioning that you don't get blown out too hard in this set, I think, for targeting cards in your graveyard. But Concoct is going to be good. It's Rise from the Grave, but it gives you selection. So if you have basically any good creatures in your deck, then this is going to be a card you're playing. Either you connive and take an opponent's small creature, or you concoct and get one of your big creatures back, or one of your value creatures. I think the mix here is really nice. Either 2 for 1 your opponent, or get back a big creature. And I'm happy casting either half of this. Next up, we have Artful Takedown, which is 2 blue-black for an instant. It's a common, which really matters here. It says choose one or both, tap target creature, and or target creature gets -2/-4 until end of turn. -2/-4 does seem like it's going to kill almost everything in this format. There's some big things in Selesnya that are going to survive that, but even -2/-4 is enough to take something down in combat if you can't just straight up kill it. And being able to tap a creature on top of that seems really good. This seems like a card that has a lot of flexibility to it as well. Please don't cast this as 4-mana tap a creature unless it wins you the game, but sometimes this just takes out 2 blockers and lets you get in there, right? A lot of times you'll use it defensively to kill a creature and then just stop an attacker for the turn, but hey, if it wins you the game, use it that way. One little thing to note here that's kind of cutesy is that your opponent's creatures, if they're playing Selesnya, are kind of like mana sources since they probably have a lot of Convoke cards. So if you're going to use this as artfully as possible, try doing it in your opponent's upkeep so that you can tap one of their creatures and they don't have an opportunity to tap that creature for Convoke when they get to their main phase. You also just kill off another creature most of the time in Selesnya, so I think Artful Takedown is going to be fantastic no matter what the matchup is, but it's just a little trick that matters when you can tap your opponent's creatures at instant speed. We have Deadly Visit, which is just your generic kill spell for the set. 5 mana, 3 double black for a common sorcery. Destroy target creature, Surveil 2. So your Witch's Mastery of the set, if you will. Surveil 2 is a nice little bonus on top of just taking out a creature, and you'll play unconditional removal spells. It's a card you'll take highly. I expect you to take it picks 2 through 4 pretty often. We have House Guild Mage. This is another cycle. The difference between these guild mages and previous guild mages is that you have to tap them for their abilities. They're all 2 mana 2/2s, one of each guild color, and then they have an activated ability, one for each of the colors of their guild. So this one is blue-black for a 2/2 human wizard. It's an uncommon, and the first ability is 1 in a blue, tap it. Target creature doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. Now, note that this doesn't actually tap their opponent's creature down or whatever creature you target. It doesn't tap it, it just stops it from untapping. So using it on an untapped creature doesn't really do that much. It is a nice little effect, though. It locks down an opponent's creature, basically as long as you want to keep activating the Guild Mage once you get it tapped in the first place. So if you find that you're behind, or you find that a big creature is attacking you or something like that, this is a nice way to control it. And then it has 2 black tap, Surveil 2. So another repeatable Surveil effect. I said there weren't very many. This is one of the few cards in the set that can do it. But being able to Surveil 2 on a whim for 3 mana is pretty good. Even if this said 2 and a black, tap Scry 2, that would be a pretty good card on top of the first ability. So you have a little bit of selection. If you need to interact with your opponent's creatures, you have the first ability. If not, then you just use the second ability and you get an advantage. You either start digging, putting cards in your graveyard. Same thing we've said about all the Surveil cards so far. This can do it over and over again. So I think the House Guild Mage is going to be one of the better ones, and it just seems strong off the first ability alone. Nightveil Predator is the type of card that I hate losing to, but hey, you're going to lose to it some amount of the time. This is also a cycle. These are very guild-specific cards. They have 2 of each color in the guild, so this one is blue, blue, black, black. Very hard to cast outside of just a dedicated Dimir deck, so the type of cards that pay you off for being the only person in a certain guild during a draft. This one happens to be an uncommon, as they all are, and it's a 3/3 flying Death Touch Hexproof. So 4 mana 3/3 hexproof flyer is something I'm already very interested in. Beats down, can't be interacted with, very hard to deal with. You basically have to put other flyers in front of this in order for you to even think about taking it down. And Death Touch means that if your opponent's playing like Selesnya or something that only has small flyers, they're going to lose everything that they block with. This can take down, 3 blockers potentially if they have to put a bunch of birds in front of it or something like that. I think the card's kind of ridiculous. I don't know why they print hexproof creatures at uncommon. I, in fact, almost made a whole video on how I feel about hexproof and how it should be removed from limited, but Nightveil Predator is a card that you're happy to play and pretty unhappy to play against. Lazav, the Multifarious, dumb name by the way, is blue-black for a 1/3 mythic legendary shapeshifter. It says when it enters the battlefield, Surveil 1. 2 mana for a 1/3 that Surveil 1. It's already like a decent card that you would play some amount of the time. We already said we would play the 3 mana 1 for Surveil 2, and this is just a turn cheaper and very similar, right? You don't care about all that though. You care about the second ability, which is X. Lazav becomes a copy of target creature card in your graveyard with converted mana cost X, except it keeps its name, it's still legendary, and it keeps its ability. So basically, for X mana, you can turn this into any creature in your graveyard that has that converted mana cost. You pay 4 mana, you turn this to any 4-drop in your graveyard. So it works really nicely with Surveil and has Surveil itself. Obviously, it's the mythic frontrunner of this set, or rather this guild, to show you what Surveil can do and what kind of payoffs you can have. If you have a bunch of sweet creatures with different abilities or different kind of purposes in your deck, then the Multifarious Lazav can fill all of those roles by putting those creatures in your graveyard. It's actually really sweet with hexproof creatures like Nightveil Predator, where you can activate the ability to turn it into a predator in response to a removal spell and just give it hexproof. You can also activate it multiple times since it keeps the ability to kind of switch what it is. For instance, you might be able to turn it into a flyer or an unblockable creature and attack with it, and once your opponent's declared that they can't block, you turn it into something else, like a big beater or something that pays you off for hitting the opponent. Just a lot of different things you can do. I really hate the name of the card, but I think the card is really sweet. Maybe not a bomb rare, maybe it is a bomb rare, who knows, but I think it's going to play out very well. And that brings us to the actual bomb rares, the cards that I have no doubt in my mind are going to be first picks. You'll see a combination of either really absurd mythics or just really efficient removal. And just off the bat, we have Price of Fame. We just saw a 5 mana sorcery destroy target creature with Surveil 2 attached. This is 4 mana, so 3 and a black, which is much more splashable than the 5 mana sorcery. It's an uncommon, it's an instant. It costs 2 less to cast if it targets a legendary creature, and it has the same effect: destroy target creature, Surveil 2. For 4 mana, instant speed, destroy anything, and sometimes cheaper if you hit a legendary creature, which matters a lot for sealed or pre-releases where people are going to have legendary creatures floating around. I think this card is absurdly good. Not like so insane that it's just game breaking, but 4 mana instant speed destroy creature is nothing to scoff at. That's one of the better removal spells we've seen in quite a while, and it's completely unconditional. It can target anything that's not hexproof, and it has a cheaper bonus against some of your opponent's better cards. Tack Surveil 2 onto that, and you've just got a great card here. I'm already pretty happy to first pick the 5 mana kill spell. That's a sorcery out of a bad pack. I'm pretty stoked to start off a draft with Price of Fame, I think. This is the type of card that you really hope somebody next to you opens a bomb and also this card so you can get past it and you don't necessarily have to first pick it. Following that up, we have Etreta, the Silencer. This is 2 blue-black for a 3/5. It's a vampire assassin. It's a rare, and it is legendary. It says it can't be blocked, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you can exile one of their creatures with a hit counter on it. They lose the game if they have 3 or more creatures exiled with hit counters on them. And then you shuffle Etreta back into your library. That's all one big trigger. As soon as you deal combat damage, that all goes on the stack simultaneously. Well, she can't be blocked, so basically you play this, you attack with it, they can't do anything about it. You get to essentially sacrifice your Etreta and exile one of your opponent's creatures. It shuffles back into your library, which means if you draw it again, you get to repeat. I don't think you are going to win too many games off of the ability, since if you're attacking with this constantly and drawing it that much, you're already dealing, a significant amount of unblockable damage. You might be able to just kill them. It plays really well with Surveil, so you can dig for it. Surveil lets you kind of find the pieces you're really looking for, and there's a lot of Surveil, so you might be able to win with the alternate win con part, but I'm not seeing it happen. I think this is just a good removal spell is what you should think about when you're attacking with this card rather than an alternate win condition. We have Thief of Sanity next, one of my favorite designs in the set. 1 blue-black for a rare 2/2 Spectre. It has flying, and it says whenever it deals damage to a player, you look at the top 3 cards of their library, you exile one of them face down, It matters that it's face down, and you put the rest into their graveyard, which also matters. That could be a downside. As long as that card remains exiled, you're allowed to look at it, you can cast it, and you can spend mana of any color to cast it, regardless of whether it's the right color or not. So every time this attacks, you essentially draw a card from your opponent's library. And just to kind of clarify some rules expectations here, if Thief of Sanity dies, you still get to cast those spells, because it says as long as the spells remain exiled, as long as they're removed from the game, it doesn't matter what happens to Thief of Sanity. 3 mana 2/2 fire, something I'm already kind of interested in. One that draws me a card every time it hits my opponent, with selection on top of that, also super interested. And one that lets me use my opponent's cards, even more interested. I like Gonti, I like effects like that that let you use your opponent's cards against them. And I think this card is just fantastic overall. Definitely the type of thing I'm first picking. I might even consider splashing this in other decks. It's just repeated card advantage if you can get it through over and over again. And again, being able to play with your opponent's cards is kind of sick, right? Dream Eater, huge Dream Eater. It's 4 blue for a 4/3 mythic rare Nightmare Sphinx, whatever that is. It has flash, it has flying, and then it does like 15 other things too. So 6 mana 4/3 flash flyer is like an okay card, but when it enters the battlefield, Surveil 4, which is great. When you do, you may return target non-land permanent an opponent controls to its owner's hand. So you surveil 4, you look at 4 cards, you can ditch some of them to the graveyard, you can keep them on top, you can do whatever you want with those, and then you get to just bounce a non-land permanent, not even a creature, just a permanent an opponent controls, back to their hand. So you're getting a lot here. You're getting like possibly a 3 or 4 for 1, and if this trades off with combat or just eats a small flyer or a small attacker, then that's great too. Get rid of your opponent's best permanent, add a big flyer to the board, and get card selection out of it. That seems like a bomb first pick to me. And then this absurdity, Doom Whisperer. I don't know why this card exists. Thanks, Wizards, for ruining Limited or whatever. 3 black for a 6/6 mythic Nightmare Demon. Normally I would see that 5 mana 6/6 fly in trample, and I'd be like, all right, well, what's the downside? Oh, what's the downside? Doom Whisperer doesn't have downside. It's all upside. Pay 2 life, surveil 2. That's upside. Where's the downside on this card? Why doesn't this like make you sacrifice a creature every turn or exile cards from your graveyard to keep it around or something like that? Why is it just a 5 mana 6/6 flyer? I do not understand. Please, Wizards, explain. Well, obviously it's mythic rare. It's here for constructed purposes, but if you play this in Limited, you're probably going to win a large percentage of your games. It's flying and tramply, so it ain't getting blocked, or at least chump blocked. It's going to win the game in a matter of couple turns. It comes down reasonably early. 5 mana for a 6/6 is no joke. It even has that little clause. I don't know how often you're going to pay life to surveil with this, but if you're in a pretty stable position and you just need to make sure that Doom Whisperer survives, then you can surveil, as many times as you think you can afford and find either removal spells or counter spells or whatever you need to back it up. Or you could just fill up your graveyard, theoretically, with enough life. You could just, mill your entire library or mill until you find certain pieces that you need in your library. It's an absurd card. You're first picking it no matter what. It might be, maybe top 3 best cards in the entire set, which is saying quite a bit. We've only looked at one guild, but the card is clearly absurd, and I don't think it takes a genius to recognize it as a bomb first pick. So that covers all of the Dimir cards. Remember, this is only cards that are tied specifically to Dimir. So cards that have Surveil tacked onto them, or cards that are specifically blue-black to cast. So if you didn't see a blue card here or a black card here, that's because it's not tied to Dimir. It's just a generic blue or black card. And remember, that'll be at the end of all these videos. So hopefully this is useful to you in some regards. I know I'm talking quite a bit about the cards, but that was the whole point of these videos. So if this was useful, then let me know. If maybe I'm giving a little bit too much information, then, whatever feedback you have about the explanations, whatever I might have missed, maybe I misread something or I misunderstood how something works, and let me know in the comments below. And as always, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Especially let me know if this is useful. If it's not, just tell me yeah, it's probably not going to cut it, but hopefully for new players, this gives them some sort of out to kind of understand the cards before they get into the pre-release. Next up, we'll be looking at a completely different color identity. We'll be looking at Boros, the aggro archetype of the format, red-white, for those who, for some reason, don't know what Boros is. And I'll be excited to talk about Mentor in that video. So stay tuned. We're going to try to pump out one of these per day, maybe more than one if I can get the recordings done in time, and hopefully this was useful. My name's Timothy here at Mana Rocks. Stay tuned for more Guilds of Ravnica limited set review with Boros up next. Thanks for watching. I'll see you there.